Wingbits is looking to disrupt the aviation industry, but more specifically, the flight data monitoring or FDM industry. And the timing could not be any more perfect because over the last few years, the way that we track flights and the data that's available to do so has seen massive advancements. And as such, the FDM industry has seen exponential growth recently. And this trend is expected to continue moving forward. Wingbits also has a key differentiator that I think will not only allow them to grab substantial market share, but really corner the market as a whole. I'm going to cover everything you need to know in this video, but before I get started, I have to remind you, nothing in this video is financial advice, and if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. Now, as I led off with, the FDM industry has seen huge growth recently as the market was valued at $9.2 billion in 2023, but is expected to reach $16.6 billion by 2030. And I'd say that investors are starting to take notice as Wingbits recently raised $3.5 million in funding. And I would not at all be surprised if we see more investors come to the table. Now, much of the growth that we're seeing in the FDM industry is due to a new way of capturing flight data called ADS-B, or Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. And this technology is rapidly replacing the archaic radar technology that's been used to track flights since the 1930s. In just over the past few years, we've seen countries all over the world start to put regulations in place that require aircrafts to have this technology. Now, ADS-B works using satellites to triangulate the position of the aircraft, and it combines it with instruments on board the aircraft to create a digital snapshot. And this snapshot includes the position, the altitude, a unique identifier for the aircraft, amongst other things. And this data is then continuously transmitted to ground stations that serve as collectors of these vast data sets. And these ground stations are really the backbone of what Wingbits is doing, because through DePIN, they're using a token reward system to incentivize deployers to set up ground stations that collect this data from aircrafts all over the world. And this data is incredibly valuable, but I do want to highlight some of the use cases that we're already seeing today, starting with the B2B space. Now, airlines can use this data now for predictive maintenance, as this data will now allow for early detection of potential failures. And this will reduce unplanned downtime and maintenance costs. They'll also be able to make better data-driven decisions around optimizing fuel consumption. And when it comes to scheduling, they'll be able to more efficiently schedule their crew members. Airlines will also be able to better optimize their usage of gates at airports, because renting gate space is incredibly expensive. And along the same lines, they'll be able to better optimize their schedule as a whole, as flight delays are incredibly costly for airlines. In fact, if you remember the Southwest debacle last holiday season, that cost Southwest an estimated $825 million. And this use case in particular is about to garner a lot more focus. That's because the Department of Transportation in the US earlier this year passed regulation that will no longer allow airlines to reimburse customers with flight vouchers or flight credits, and instead will have to reimburse with cash payments. So there's no doubt that all this data being collected is going to be a complete game changer for airlines. But other use cases include insurance, as you need to be able to track all the inventory and specific weather events to be able to assess the damage and the cost of an insurance claim. Companies like UPS and FedEx can also benefit from ADS-B, as they will have improved capabilities to track air freight. And of course, for airports, the air traffic controllers will now have more data at their fingertips, which will result in better overall safety for the aviation industry. And outside of B2B, there's certainly a B2C market, as there are a lot of flight enthusiasts out there that are paying for subscriptions to access data from these FDM companies today. And as we get new iterations of ADS-B, there will be more data collected. For example, we're coming up on version 3 where there will be additional weather data collected, and there will be better tracking for aircrafts at higher altitudes and higher velocities. And as more data is collected and you combine that with the emergence of AI and being able to make that data valuable, well, there's absolutely going to be more use cases that emerge. And as such, there's going to be additional revenue streams that are available. Needless to say, there is a huge market for Wingbits to tap into, but the question is, can they grab market share from the competition? And I would say the answer is a resounding yes. And the reason behind that is because of the way that these competitors are building out their infrastructure. That's because they are relying on hobbyists or flight enthusiasts to set up these ground stations today. And while in some cases they are getting access to some of the flight tracking tools in return, they are not getting any direct compensation. And this becomes a major problem when you look at the quality of data that's collected, because they have no incentive to optimize their setups. And this leads to ground stations that don't have a clear line of sight and good coverage, or that have excessive downtime or latency issues. It's also very difficult to pinpoint the exact location of where these deployments are. But Wingbits, through the power of DePIN and a token reward system, have the ability to address all this, because they have their system set up such that they incentivize deployers to optimize their setups. So if they go the extra step to set up a station with better line of sight that provides better coverage and They have better uptime and less latency, and as such are bringing more value to the network, well, they receive better token rewards. They'll also be able to align the reward system to promote deployments in certain geographical areas where coverage does not exist today. And I can't stress how important this is, because the whole FDM industry is based on the collection of this data and then on the back end making that data valuable and useful for the end consumer. But it's only as good as the data that you input into the system. And through the power of DePIN, Wingbits is going to be able to collect vastly better data than the competition. And in the end, that means they're going to be able to bring a much better product to the end user. That is, as long as they're able to grow the network enough to get global coverage. And in listening to interviews and speaking with the founder myself, they estimate they'll need about 3,000 ground stations to get good global coverage. But in order to get both good global coverage and enough redundancy to truly tackle the total global addressable market, they estimate they'll need to have about 10,000 ground stations deployed. And now, as it stands today, they're at about 2,000 ground stations deployed, but they also have a lot of pent-up demand. That's because they recently announced a partnership with Geodnet, one of my favorite projects in the space, and they're launching a new hardware device that will dual mine the GOD token and the Wingbits token. This hardware will also capitalize on Geodnet's capabilities to verify the precise location of the deployments. Now, this hardware is expected to start shipping early on in Q1, but they are seeing about 15 pre-orders per day right now. So when you look at that growth trajectory and consider where we are in this market cycle and the fact that Wingbits and Geodnet will now be able to tap into each other's communities for growth, I expect they'll be able to hit that 10,000 mark likely midway through 2025. But here's the great part. You're not late to the party because their Mainnet launch, their token launch, is not expected to happen until early on in Q1 of next year. Now, while we don't have the full tokenomics details yet, they are building on Solana. And just like all DePIN projects, there will be utility associated with the token as revenue comes through the door. That said, I will absolutely do a follow-up video once we have the full tokenomics details to break them down. Also going to be doing an interview with their founder and CEO. And I do expect that there are some very exciting announcements we'll be able to discuss in that interview, so you should definitely be on the lookout for that. But in summary, Wingbits is moving into this industry, an industry that just experienced its biggest advancement in decades. And that has opened up the door for exponential growth when it comes to revenue. They also have a critical differentiator that I think is going to allow them to grab market share from the competition and a clear path for the network to hit the milestones necessary to capture the total global addressable market. And it's for those reasons that I expect Wingbits will be one of the best performing DePIN projects moving forward. But let me know what your thoughts are on Wingbits below. As always, I appreciate your viewership. Signing off, this is Bradley Meyer with the DePIN Connection.